I don't say this lightly. In fact, I almost never say it at all. Most differences aren't real. They're variations, small changes in presentation, not in structure. People confuse novelty with difference. They confuse intensity with depth. They confuse uniqueness with unpredictability. True difference is rare. I learned that by paying attention to patterns instead of people. Patterns don't flatter you. They don't care how you feel. They repeat honestly. And most people repeat themselves, even when they think they're changing. I've met thousands of intelligent people, creative people, ambitious people, people with impressive stories and strong opinions. On the surface, many of them look different, but structurally, they behave the same. They want to be seen, but not examined. They want closeness, but on their terms. They want connection, but without friction. That combination never works for long. So when I say someone is different, I'm not talking about personality. Personality is decoration. I'm talking about how someone operates under pressure, under uncertainty, under silence. That's where difference shows up. Most systems reveal themselves under load. Most systems reveal themselves under load. I noticed you first in the absence of noise, not in what you said, but in what you didn't rush to fill. Silence didn't make you uncomfortable. You didn't treat pauses like problems that needed solving. That stood out. Most people mistake silence for danger. They rush to explain, reassure, perform. You didn't. You allowed space to exist. Space changes dynamics. It exposes intent. At first I assumed it was restraint, maybe discipline, maybe emotional control. But over time, it became clear it wasn't restraint, it was confidence. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence. Structural confidence. Confidence that doesn't need constant feedback. Feedback addiction is common. Stability is rare. I started noticing how you handled ambiguity. Most people treat ambiguity as threat. They try to resolve it quickly, even if the resolution is inaccurate. You didn't rush. You let uncertainty breathe. That's not passivity. That's tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty changes everything. It prevents premature decisions. I also noticed how little you try to impress. No exaggerated stories. No strategic vulnerability. No attempts to control how you were perceived. You weren't optimizing for approval. That's unusual. Most people are constantly negotiating their image. They adjust tone, posture, language trying to land somewhere safe. You stayed accurate. Accuracy is risky. It limits who connects with you. But it filters better. I realized something important then. You weren't trying to be understood by everyone. You were trying to be understood correctly. Those are very different goals. Trying to be understood by everyone leads to dilution. Trying to be understood correctly leads to precision. Precision is calm. Calm unnerves people who rely on reaction. I've seen how people behave when they sense difference. They test it. They poke at it. They try to pull it into familiar patterns. Most differences collapse under pressure. Yours didn't. You didn't harden. You didn't withdraw. You didn't over-explain. You stayed consistent. Consistency is evidence. Evidence is rare in relationships. Evidence is rare in relationships. I noticed that being around you didn't fragment attention. My thinking stayed intact. Focus didn't degrade. Decisions didn't become reactive. That's not chemistry. That's coherence. Coherence tells you whether something supports your system or interference is expensive. I've learned to pay attention to how interactions affect operation. Not how they feel in the moment, but how they change clarity afterward. After you, things felt clearer. Not euphoric, not distracted, clear. Clarity is underrated. Clarity is underrated. I also noticed how little emotional management was required. I wasn't anticipating reactions. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I wasn't calibrating tone to prevent misunderstanding. That's rare. Most connections require constant emotional labor. You reduced it. Reduction is optimization. Reduction is optimization. I started asking myself why this felt different. Not in a romantic sense, but in a structural one. The answer wasn't excitement. It wasn't novelty. It was alignment and behavior. You didn't pull, you didn't chase, you didn't retreat, you responded. Response is different from reaction. Reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. You also didn't confuse intensity with importance. When something mattered, you showed it through consistency, not urgency. Urgency pressures systems. Consistency stabilizes them. That's when I realized something else. You weren't trying to be special. You weren't trying to stand out. You were just being accurate. Accuracy creates natural separation. Most people never risk that. I've noticed that truly different people don't advertise it. They don't signal uniqueness. They don't need to. Difference shows up in outcomes. How conflict behaves. How silence is handled. How uncertainty is tolerated. With you, conflict didn't escalate. Silence didn't distort. Uncertainty didn't trigger fear. That's not accidental. That's design. I also noticed something subtle but important. You didn't try to accelerate closeness. You let it unfold at the speed of information. Information takes time. Rushing compresses data. Compression hides flaws. You didn't compress. Most people want reassurance. You seemed more interested in truth, even when truth was less comforting. That's rare. Comfort feels good. Truth lasts longer. Longevity depends on truth. Don't say someone is different because they made me feel something intense. Intensity fades. I say someone is different when they improve how I think. You did. Not by advising. Not by inspiring. By not interfering. Non-interference is powerful. That's when I understood why this felt unfamiliar. I wasn't being pulled into something. I wasn't being distracted. I was being supported. Support doesn't demand attention. It enables function. Function is the real test. Function is the real test. I don't know where this leads yet. Difference doesn't guarantee permanence. Nothing does. But difference does change probability. Probability matters more than promises. Promises are easy. Patterns are honest. This is why I almost never say this. Because once you say someone is truly different, you're acknowledging that most connections aren't built to last. They're built to stimulate. Stimulation fades. Difference compounds. Compounding is quiet. That's where part one ends. Not with declaration, not with certainty. With recognition. Recognition that some people don't enter your life to excite it, but to stabilize it. And that kind of difference is rare. Shh. If this made you stop scrolling, like this video. If you value clarity over noise and substance over performance, subscribe. And if something here felt familiar to your own experience, leave a comment, even one word. Some people don't change how you feel. They change how you operate. Once you recognize real difference, you can't unsee it. It changes how everything else is evaluated, not emotionally but structurally. The baseline shifts. What once felt acceptable starts feeling noisy. What once felt exciting starts feeling unstable. What once felt normal starts feeling inefficient. Difference recalibrates standards. That's why most people avoid recognizing it. It makes compromise harder. After that realization, I started paying attention to what changed inside me, not toward you, but around everything else. Conversations that used to hold my attention now felt scattered. Interactions that once felt engaging now felt performative. Not wrong, just misaligned. Difference doesn't make everything else bad. It makes everything else visible. Visibility changes tolerance. I noticed that I became less patient with emotional noise. Not because I cared less, but because I'd experienced what low-friction interaction felt like. Once you know what coherence feels like, incoherence becomes expensive. Expense shows up as fatigue, as distraction, as subtle resistance. Resistance is data. I also noticed something uncomfortable. Difference creates responsibility. When you recognize that something operates better, you're forced to confront why you've accepted less in the past. That confrontation isn't pleasant. It challenges old narratives, old justifications, old compromises. Most compromises aren't strategic. They're habitual. I started reviewing patterns, not people, patterns, where I tolerated misalignment because it was familiar, where I confused intensity for importance, or I allowed urgency to override accuracy. Those weren't accidents. They were unexamined defaults. Defaults run quietly until you change environments. Being around you felt like a different environment, not stimulating, clarifying. My internal system ran cleaner, less background processing, fewer defensive calculations that exposed how much effort I'd been spending compensating elsewhere. Compensation drains energy. Drained energy distorts judgment. I realized that difference doesn't ask for attention. It asks for honesty. Honesty about what works. Honesty about what doesn't. That kind of honesty forces decisions. Not immediately, but inevitably. Inevitable doesn't mean rushed. I also noticed that you didn't seem invested in being perceived as different. You weren't waiting for acknowledgement. You weren't signaling uniqueness. That's usually the strongest indicator. People who are different don't need to convince you. They don't need positioning. Difference shows up in consistency. Consistency under time is evidence. I watched how you handled repetition. Most people degrade under repetition. Most people degrade under repetition. Their best qualities show early then fade. Yours didn't. You didn't rely on novelty to stay engaged. You didn't escalate to maintain interest. You stayed stable. Stability is misunderstood. People think stability is static. It's not. Stability allows complexity. It creates room for nuance, disagreement, silence, and time. Time is the real test. Anything can look different briefly. Very few things remain different over time. Time removes performance. Time removes performance. I noticed how your presence affected pacing. Interactions slowed naturally, not awkwardly, not forcefully, naturally. There was no pressure to accelerate intimacy, no sense that something needed to happen quickly to validate itself. Validation wasn't the goal. That stood out. Most connections seek validation immediately. Most connections seek validation immediately. I also noticed how disagreement behaved. It didn't escalate. It didn't become personal. It didn't trigger narrative defense. Disagreement stayed informational. That's rare. Most people hear disagreement as rejection. They respond by defending identity instead of exploring difference. You didn't. You stayed curious. Curiosity is a sign of security. Insecure systems protect position. Secure systems seek understanding. That difference compounds over time. Compounding doesn't announce itself. I started noticing how little management was required. No emotional buffering, no careful phrasing, no strategic silence. You didn't require me to adjust myself to be understood. You met accuracy with accuracy. That's unusual. Most systems punish accuracy. I also noticed that you didn't confuse openness with availability. You were present but not consumable. That distinction matters. Availability without boundaries leads to depletion. Boundaries without openness lead to distance. You held both. That balance is rare. As time passed, the recognition of difference stopped feeling special and started feeling structural. It wasn't about you anymore. It was about what the interaction enabled. It enabled clearer thinking, more stable attention, better decisions. That's when it became undeniable. Difference isn't about attraction. It's about function. Function reveals truth. I realized something else then. Difference doesn't ask you to change immediately. It asks you to notice. Notice what drains you. Notice what steadies you. Notice what expands capacity instead of consuming it. Noticing is the beginning of redesign. Redesign is uncomfortable. Because redesign means admitting that some familiar structures no longer make sense. That some ways of relating are inefficient, not because they're wrong, but because you evolved past them. Evolution creates mismatch. Mismatch creates discomfort. Discomfort signals growth. I also noticed that difference sharpened boundaries. Not rigid ones, clear ones. I became less tolerant of ambiguity masquerading as depth. Depth doesn't avoid clarity. It demands it. You didn't blur lines to feel close. You didn't dramatize uncertainty. That allowed trust to form without force. Forced trust collapses. Forced trust collapses. I started seeing why people often miss true difference. It doesn't feel intoxicating. It doesn't overwhelm. It doesn't hijack attention. It steadies. And steadiness doesn't sell well in a culture addicted to spikes. Spikes fade quickly. Difference doesn't ask you to abandon everything else. It integrates, it supports, it operates quietly in the background. Like good infrastructure, you don't notice it until it's gone. Then everything breaks. I also noticed that imagining the future didn't trigger anxiety. There was no urgency to define outcomes, no need to secure guarantees. The process felt sufficient. Process efficiency is rare. Most people cling to outcomes because they don't trust process. Trust reduces control impulses. You didn't need control. You didn't need reassurance. You didn't need certainty to stay present. That signaled confidence not in outcome, but in self. Confidence like that doesn't seek confirmation. It just operates. At some point, the realization settled fully. Not emotionally, logically. You were different because you reduced friction instead of creating it, because you increased clarity instead of noise, because you increased clarity instead of consuming it. Those qualities don't excite immediately. They endure. Endurance is the real differentiator. I know what comes next. Difference doesn't promise permanence. It only improves probability. Probability matters. Because life isn't built on guarantees. It's built on systems that can withstand time. Time is the final evaluator. That's where part 2 ends. Not with certainty. Not with declaration. With awareness. Awareness that true difference doesn't demand attention. It earns trust. And once you experience it, you can't pretend it doesn't matter. If this made you reflect, instead of scroll, like this video. If you value depth over drama and clarity over chaos, subscribe. And if something here resonated with your own experience, leave a comment, even one word. Some people don't change your life overnight. They change what you're no longer willing to accept. And that's the real difference. Once difference is fully recognized, it stops being about comparison. You're no longer measuring people against each other. You're measuring systems against reality. That's a critical shift. Most people evaluate relationships emotionally. They ask how something feels in the moment, how intense it is, how validating, how consuming. That's not evaluation, that's reaction. True evaluation happens over time, under pressure, and in repetition. Repetition removes illusion. I started noticing how difference behaves when novelty disappears, because novelty always disappears. That's not pessimism, that's physics. Anything driven by novelty requires constant input to sustain itself. When input drops, the system destabilizes. Difference didn't destabilize. It remained intact. That's rare. Most connections degrade once there's nothing new to discover. Conversation loops. Interest fades. Effort increases just to maintain baseline engagement. With you, baseline engagement didn't require effort. Effort went into growth, not maintenance. That distinction matters. Maintenance-heavy systems collapse first. I noticed that repetition didn't flatten things. It refined them. Small behaviors stayed consistent. Tone stayed stable. Intent didn't drift. There was no gradual erosion. Erosion is usually subtle. You don't notice it until structure fails. It wasn't happening here. Stability under time is evidence. I also noticed how difference affected self-perception. Not ego. Not confidence. Accuracy. I wasn't exaggerating myself. I wasn't minimizing myself. I wasn't editing to fit expectation. I was just precise. Precision feels strange when you're used to adjustment. Adjustment is exhausting. Most people don't realize how much energy they spend calibrating themselves to be acceptable. They adjust tone, opinions, interests sometimes without noticing. You didn't require that. That absence of adjustment was freeing. Freedom increases honesty. Another change became obvious. Time felt different. Not faster. Not slower. More intentional. Moments weren't rushed. Silence wasn't threatening. Pauses weren't interpreted as loss of interest. Nothing needed rescuing. Most relationships are constantly being rescued. Rescue dynamics create dependency. Difference removed the need for rescue. Nothing felt like it was slipping unless attention was applied. Attention was a choice, not a requirement. That's structural safety. Safety supports complexity. I noticed how disagreement continued to behave. It didn't accumulate. It didn't leave residue. It didn't resurface disguised as something else. Disagreement stayed local. Local problems are solvable. Global problems aren't. Most relationships turn local issues into global threats because past noise contaminates the present. That wasn't happening. Clean systems isolate faults. I also noticed how boundaries functioned. They weren't enforced. They weren't negotiated. They were implicit, respected through behavior. That's the strongest form of boundary. When boundaries need constant explanation, something is wrong. Explanation indicates friction. Difference also changed how trust formed. It wasn't built through declarations. It wasn't built through intensity. It was built through predictability. Predictability isn't boring. It's stabilizing. When you know how a system responds, you can rely on it. Reliability compounds. I started noticing how rare it is to feel mentally uninterrupted around someone. Most interactions fragment attention slightly. They pull you into management mode. This didn't. Thought stayed linear. Decisions stayed clear. That's not coincidence. Mental coherence is a signal. I realized that difference doesn't create emotional highs. It creates cognitive ease. Ease allows capacity. Capacity allows long-term thinking. Most relationships shrink time horizons. They pull attention into the present moment at the cost of the future. This expanded horizons. Expansion is subtle. Another thing became clear. Difference didn't make me want to escape uncertainty. It made me more tolerant of it. Uncertainty didn't feel like instability. It felt like openness. That's a major distinction. People rush certainty when they don't trust process. Here, process felt trustworthy. Trust reduces urgency. I also noticed that emotional labor had decreased significantly. There was no constant checking in. No silent recalibration. No behind-the-scenes adjustment. That doesn't mean care was missing. It means care was efficient. Efficient care lasts longer. I started understanding why truly different people often feel intimidating. They remove excuses. When something functions cleanly, dysfunction elsewhere becomes obvious. That's uncomfortable. It forces self-reflection. Self-reflection is costly. Difference made me question patterns I had normalized. Why did some connections feel draining? Why did others require constant reassurance? The answer wasn't complexity. It was misalignment. Difference exposes misalignment without accusation. That's powerful. Power doesn't need volume. I noticed how little future projection was happening. Not because there was no future, but because it didn't need scripting. The present felt sufficient. Sufficiency reduces anxiety. Anxiety distorts planning. This is where most people misunderstand difference. They think it should feel extraordinary. It doesn't. It feels sustainable. Sustainability isn't exciting. It's dependable. Dependability is what builds lives. Lives aren't built on spikes. I also noticed that difference didn't trigger possessiveness. There was no urge to secure, define, or label prematurely. Ownership instincts are fear responses. Fear wasn't driving behavior. Absence of fear improves choice. Another subtle shift, gratitude appeared, not for attention, but for clarity. Clarity about what matters. Clarity about what doesn't. Difference simplifies values. Simplification reduces noise. Noise wastes time. I understood then why I rarely say this. Because acknowledging true difference means admitting that many connections are built on compromise, not compatibility. Compromise feels mature, but excessive compromise erodes integrity. Difference preserves integrity. Integrity stabilizes identity. I also notice how endings were imagined differently. Not with fear, not with avoidance, with realism. Difference didn't promise permanence. They promised accuracy while present. Accuracy is enough. Promises fail. Accuracy and Zoph. Promises fail. Accuracy endures. At this stage, difference stopped being about you as a person. It became about a standard for how interaction should feel, how communication should function, how effort should be applied. Standards once raised don't lower easily. That's irreversible. This is why people sometimes resist true difference. It forces change not in the relationship, but in expectations everywhere else. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior reveals values. I realized that even if nothing else happened, this recognition had already changed something fundamental. I could no longer pretend noise was depth. I could no longer accept instability as passion. I could no longer confuse effort with value. Difference recalibrates perception. Perception shapes reality. That's where part 3 ends. Not with escalation, not with conclusion, with internal recalibration. Recalibration of standards. Recalibration of tolerance. Recalibration of what different actually means. Shh. If this part made you reflect instead of react, like this video, if you value clarity over comfort and depth over distraction, subscribe. And if something here matched what you've experienced but never named, leave a comment, even one word. Some people don't change your direction, they change your calibration. And once that happens, nothing feels the same again. After recalibration happens, difference stops being something you notice occasionally. It becomes something you operate from. It quietly rewrites your internal reference system. Not emotionally, structurally. What once felt acceptable now feels misaligned. What once felt impressive now feels noisy. What once felt intense now feels inefficient. Difference doesn't shout. It corrects. Correction is rarely comfortable. I noticed that my tolerance for chaos dropped. Not because I became rigid, but because I became clearer. Chaos stopped feeling exciting and started feeling expensive. Expensive in attention. Expensive in energy. Expensive in long-term cost. When you experience low-friction interaction, high-friction interaction becomes impossible to ignore. Contrast sharpens perception. I also noticed how often people mistake emotional stimulation for connection. Stimulation feels alive because it demands response. But demand isn't depth. Depth doesn't pull, it holds. With you, nothing was pulling me off center. There was no emotional gravity distorting priorities. I didn't feel drawn away from myself to stay connected. That's rare. Most relationships subtly require self-abandonment. Small compromises, minor distortions, gradual adjustments you don't notice until you're tired. Fatigue is delayed feedback. Difference removed that fatigue. Not because it gave energy, but because it stopped draining it. Energy preservation is more important than energy creation. Preserved energy compounds. Compounding is quiet. I started noticing how much of my previous relational effort was actually compensation. Filling gaps, smoothing misalignment, translating signals. Translation cost cognitive load. With you, translation wasn't necessary. Signals were clean. Intent matched behavior. That alignment reduced internal processing. Reduced processing increases clarity. Another shift became obvious. I no longer felt the need to manage expectations. Expectations settled naturally through consistency. Consistency is the strongest form of communication. When consistency is present, explanation becomes optional. Optional explanation is freedom. I also noticed how difference affected pacing. Everything slowed, not artificially, but naturally. There was no urgency to define, label, or escalate. Urgency is usually compensation for uncertainty. Uncertainty here felt tolerable. Tolerance is confidence. Confidence doesn't demand outcomes. It trusts process. Process trust changes behavior subtly. You stop forcing moments. You stop extracting meaning prematurely. You allow information to accumulate. Accumulated information reveals truth. Truth takes time. I realized the difference wasn't making me more selective because I wanted less. It was making me more selective because I understood more. Understanding reduces tolerance for misalignment. Misalignment isn't dramatic, it's draining. Draining systems don't last. I noticed that silence felt increasingly valuable. Not awkward, not empty. Valuable. Silence became a place where nothing needed to be managed. Management-free space is rare. Most interactions require constant adjustment. You didn't require that. That absence was noticeable. Another important change, I stopped confusing effort with care. Care didn't require strain. It showed up in reliability, not intensity. Intensity burns fast. Reliability endures. This difference matters over years, not moments. Years expose design quality. I also noticed that difference didn't inflate importance. It didn't create obsession. It didn't narrow my world. It expanded it. My thinking widened. Long-term plans felt easier to hold. Stress didn't leak into connection. That's structural support. Support improves resilience. I began to understand why true difference is often overlooked. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't create stories people like to tell. It creates stability. Stability doesn't trend, but it lasts. I also noticed how little fear was involved. No fear of losing. No fear of missing out. No fear of not being enough. Fear drives most attachment behavior. Without fear, attachment changes shape. It becomes choice. Choice feels different from compulsion. Choice is calm. Compulsion is urgent. You didn't make me feel chosen. You made choice feel possible. That's a subtle but important distinction. Possibility reduces pressure. I noticed that conflict, when it appeared, stayed contained. It didn't expand into identity or history. It didn't recruit the past. It stayed present. Present-focused conflict is solvable. History-heavy conflict isn't. I also noticed that my internal dialogue quieted. Fewer hypothetical scenarios. Less second-guessing. Less rehearsing. Mental quiet is a sign of alignment. Noise usually indicates unresolved threat. Threat perception drives overthinking. Difference also changed how I viewed compatibility. Compatibility wasn't about shared interests or opinions. It was about compatible nervous systems, how stress was handled, how ambiguity was tolerated, how silence was interpreted. Those things determine durability. Durability is the real metric. I realized that difference doesn't make you want more, it makes you want less noise, less explanation, less drama, less effort spent maintaining stability. Stability should be inherent, not enforced. Enforced stability fails. Another subtle realization followed. I stopped romanticizing potential. Potential is dangerous when it replaces evidence. With you, I wasn't imagining who you could be. I was observing who you consistently were. Consistency removes fantasy. Fantasy distorts judgment. I noticed that difference didn't pull me toward dependency. There was no merging of identity, no loss of autonomy. Autonomy remained intact. That's healthy. Healthy systems preserve boundaries naturally. I also noticed how endings were perceived. Not with panic. Not with denial. With realism. Difference didn't promise permanence. It promised accuracy while present. Accuracy is enough to build with. Building requires truth. This is where difference stops being about connection and starts being about standards. Standards for communication. Standards for effort. Standards for emotional labor. Once raised, standards don't easily lower. Once raised, standards don't easily lower. That's irreversible. I understood then why I almost never say this out loud. Because acknowledging true difference forces change even if nothing else happens. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you ignore. It changes what you're willing to invest in. Difference reshapes priorities. Priorities shape life. This part isn't about conclusion. It's about consequence. The consequence of recognizing something that works better than what you're used to. You can't unknow it. Awareness doesn't reverse. That's where part 4 ends. Not with commitment, not with certainty, with realignment. Realignment of standards, realignment of tolerance, realignment of tolerance, realignment of what different actually costs and what it gives back. Shh. If this part made you pause instead of react, like this video. If you value clarity over chaos and depth over noise, subscribe. And if something here matched a shift you felt but never named, leave a comment, even one word. Some people don't enter your life to stay forever. They enter to change the way you measure everything after. And that's real difference. After realignment settles in, something subtle but permanent happens. Difference stops being something you observe and starts being something you operate from. It becomes a baseline, not a feeling, not a thought, not a comparison, a baseline. Most people never reach this stage because it doesn't feel rewarding in the way intensity does. There's no emotional spike, no dramatic certainty, no sense of arrival, just quiet stability. And stability doesn't trend. When difference becomes a baseline, your internal system recalibrates automatically. You don't consciously reject noise that simply fails to hold your attention. You don't analyze misalignment, it reveals itself quickly. What once required effort to tolerate now feels inefficient. Inefficiency becomes obvious when you've experienced coherence. Coherence sharpens perception. I noticed that decision-making changed. Not because choices became easier, but because fewer options felt viable. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Clarity narrows choices in a good way. Most people think freedom means more options. It doesn't. Freedom means fewer wrong ones. Wrong options drain life quietly. I also noticed how emotional reactions softened, not because I cared less, but because fewer things reached the threshold of importance. Emotional energy became selective. Selectivity is maturity. When everything matters, nothing does. Energy needs direction. Difference also changed how I related to time. There was no urgency to define outcomes, no pressure to lock things in. Time felt like an ally instead of a threat. Threat perception accelerates behavior. Safety allows pacing. You didn't accelerate time, you slowed distortion. Distortion is what makes time feel scarce. I realized that most connections consume time because they create instability that needs managing. When instability is absent, time expands. Expansion doesn't feel exciting. It feels usable. Usable time changes life. Life is built in usable time. Another shift became undeniable. I stopped trying to extract meaning from moments. Meaning didn't need extraction, it accumulated naturally. Extraction is a sign of insecurity. Accumulation is a sign of trust. Trust doesn't rush. Rushing breaks things that could have lasted. I also noticed how difference affected my tolerance for emotional volatility. Volatility didn't feel romantic anymore. It felt like system failure. Failure isn't dramatic, it's expensive. Volatility creates unpredictable cost. Unpredictable cost kills long-term systems. Difference didn't make me idealize you. It did the opposite. It grounded perception. You weren't elevated. You were understood. Understanding is steadier than admiration. Admiration fades. Understanding holds. Holding is underrated. Holding is underrated. I also noticed that silence reached a new depth. Silence wasn't a pause between moments. It was a state where nothing needed improvement. That's rare. Most silence feels incomplete because something is unresolved. Here, nothing was unresolved. Here, nothing was unresolved. Another important realization followed. Difference didn't create attachment. It reduced it. Not because connection weakened, but because fear wasn't fueling it. Fear-driven attachment clings. Clarity-driven connection chooses. Choice feels lighter than need. Need distorts behavior. I noticed that my internal narratives simplified. Fewer stories, fewer interpretations, fewer imagined futures. Imagination returned to creativity instead of defense. That matters. Defense consumes imagination. Defense also changed how endings were imagined. Not with dread, not with denial, with realism. If something ended, it wouldn't invalidate what it was, meaning didn't depend on permanence. That's a critical shift. Most people chase permanence to justify investment. Investment can be valid without guarantees. Guarantees are a substitute for trust. I realized that difference didn't promise happiness. It promised functionality. And functionality is what happiness rests on. Happiness without function collapses. Function without happiness still builds something durable. Durability matters more than mood. I also noticed that difference eliminated comparison, not just between people, but between past and present. There was no internal scoreboard. Comparison only exists when something feels incomplete. Completeness removes it. Completeness is quiet. I love a subtle shift. I stopped explaining myself internally. I didn't justify choices. I didn't rehearse reasons. Justification is a sign of misalignment. Alignment removes the need to defend. Defense wastes energy. I understood then why truly different people often feel unsettling. They don't validate coping mechanisms. They expose them. Exposure isn't aggressive. It's clarifying. Clarity changes behavior even when nothing else changes. That's power. Difference also reshaped how value was measured. Value wasn't in intensity, frequency, or affirmation. Value was in consistency, clarity, and low friction. Low friction doesn't excite, it endures. Endurance builds futures. I also noticed that gratitude replaced desire. Not gratitude toward you, but gratitude toward the standard you revealed. A standard that made compromise visible. A standard that made chaos obvious. A standard that made silence safe. Standards that made silence safe. Standards outlast people. That's why difference matters even if nothing else happens. This is where the story completes. Not because something ends, but because something stabilizes. Difference stops being a thought. It becomes orientation. Orientation determines direction. Direction determines life.